I have been lifting for 8 years and have achieved this transformation. In this video, I'll tell you the key metric to optimize for when your goal is the fastest muscle growth possible, how I define it, why it is the best metric, and how to optimize for it. The key metric to optimize for when trying to maximize muscle growth is long-term strength progression. What do I mean with progression? So let's differentiate between progressive overload and progression. Overload means that the stress placed on a muscle in a training session needs to be great enough to elicit adaptation. That's the overload principle. Progressive overload then refers to a gradual increase in training stress to elicit continued adaptation. And progression refers to your ability to progressively overload over time. Why is long-term strength progression the best metric to optimize for when trying to maximize muscle growth? That's because in the long term, muscle size and strength are very highly correlated within individuals, almost one-to-one. If you were to compare two different training approaches over a year, and one increases your bench by 100 pounds and the other one by 50 pounds in that year, the former is obviously much better at building muscle, assuming everything else would have been kept the same. So how do you maximize long-term strength progression? There are two key inputs for muscle growth. Muscle growth stimulus from training and the recovery environment, nutrition, sleep, stress level, etc. The muscle growth stimulus from training is what really matters because it determines the magnitude of the potential muscle growth you could get, besides your genetics, of course. And the recovery environment is really just permissive for growth. If it is optimized, your body will actualize 100% of the potential growth you stimulated. That means if your nutrition and sleep are not dialed in, the synthesis of new muscle tissue will be diminished even if your training is good. The good news is recovery is easy to get right. You need a small calorie surplus or at least not a deficit, adequate protein intake, high quality sleep for 7.5 to 9 hours, or at least not sleep dead, and little other physical stressors. On the other hand, it's much harder to pin down what the most growth promoting training looks like for you. That's because practically there has to exist an inverse U relationship between training volume and muscle growth. Generally, the more volume you do, the more muscle growth you get. However, there has to exist a point where the body's recovery cannot keep up with the amount of training volume that you're doing. At that point, it is hypothesized that the muscle growth decreases and at some point you even start losing muscle. The challenge now is to find the volume sweet spot for you. So how do we go about finding that? Before I get into that, let me get one thing out of the way first. Many people seem to think that maximizing short-term strength progression translates to maximizing long-term strength progression. That's not how it works. In the short term, strength expression can be confounded by fatigue, skill acquisition, and neuromuscular adaptations. Now, let's start by looking at the data. From the most recent meta-regression on the impact of volume on hypertrophy by Pallant et al., one could conclude that more volume tends to be better. However, the average study duration of the data included in the meta-regression was about 10 weeks. On top of that, they only trained at most 1 to 3 muscle groups at a time, never the whole body. So what this meta-regression actually shows is that doing upwards of 30 fraction sets per week for 1 to 3 muscle groups at a time for an average duration of 10 weeks seems to produce the most muscle growth in these muscle groups. As discussed earlier, there has to exist a point where one is doing too much volume. Not only due to an increase in risk of injury, but also due to an inverse U relationship between volume and hypertrophy. So for the highest return on effort, we should try to stay to the left side of the point where more volume becomes counterproductive. Since more volume leads to increasingly less additional hypertrophy, I would argue that the best place to start is a few sets above your minimum effective dose of training volume. For most beginners to intermediates, 10 fractional sets per week is probably a good few sets above their minimum effective volume, which makes it a good starting point. But you would, of course, still have to work up to this if you're used to less. So how do you actually go about finding your best training volume? You set up an experiment where you try a training approach with a certain amount of training volume for at least 8 weeks. After these 8 or more weeks, you should have been able to progress on most of your lifts. Now you have two options. One, continue progressing like that, or second, try increasing the volume by a few sets to see if you could progress even faster. You should only ever do the second option if you're recovering well and everything outside the gym is on point, like your sleep, nutrition, and overall stress level. If after another 8+ weeks of doing higher volumes, you're progressing at a faster rate, you're likely gaining more muscle mass. You can now go on like that until you found a point where progression is worse than in the previous 8 or more weeks. All in all, more volume seems to be better as long as you can recover from it. That means as long as you're progressing, you can try adding more volume. If progress slows down or you start losing strength, you might have overdone it and need to reduce the volume.